Howdy y'all! Back in 1960, a little-known film titled Psycho debuted in theaters. 23 years later, Psycho 2 was released, becoming a very early example of a legacy sequel. Let's just say this film was not as well regarded as its predecessor, nor as well remembered for that matter. I made the small joke of just passing over Psycho a second ago because, yeah, it's Psycho, one of the most revered films of all time. You'll find no shortage of people calling it a masterpiece. Most don't even know that it's based on a book, let alone the fact that it had a sequel in the 80s. The majority of people either don't know of Psycho 2's existence, or they've heard about it and have just immediately dismissed it on the spot. Oh, a sequel to one of the best films of all time? That came out 2 decades later? Yeah, I'm sure that's a real winner. Though this film has grown a small bit of a cult following through the years, growing a reputation as being one of the most underrated sequels of all time. Is there something to this movie that's been overlooked for so long? Well, let's find out by first going over Chapter 1. The plot. Preface, actually. Spoilers ahead. Okay, so I'm sort of breaking character here. I just want to say this up front. Psycho 2 is a really solid movie, like surprisingly good, better than it has any right to be. I know saying this up front is kind of breaking the format of my videos, but unlike the first film, which is so well known that it's kind of impossible for a first time viewer to not already know the plot through popular culture, Psycho 2 is obscure enough for its plot to not be spoiled all over the place. So if you have not seen this film, please exit this video right now and watch the movie. I am going to dive into spoilers later, so please exit the video and watch the film blind. It is a really good sequel that deserves more recognition. Though, in saying that, after you're done watching the movie, please come back to watch the rest of this video. I need that precious watch time, and while you're at it, click like and Chapter 1 for real this time. The plot. Norman Bates, after 23 years of being locked up in a psychiatric hospital, is in a hearing to see if he should be released, much to the chagrin of Lila Loomis, the sister of Marion Crane, who you might remember from this scene in the first film. Lila, still angered at the death of her sister, urges the court to keep Norman locked up, lest he kills again. But her complaints fall on deaf ears. Norman is deemed to have been returned to sanity and is officially reinstated back into society. Norman, with the aid of his doctor, tries his best to live back in his old house, still haunted by the memories the decrepit place holds. Finding new work at a local diner, he quickly befriends one of his co-workers. After finding out that she has nowhere to go, Norman offers Mary a bedroom in his home. The two live together for a bit, growing a close friendship. Though things take a turn for the worse when Norman receives letters from his dead mother, and starts to see her again as well. Even worse though is when a series of murders start to take place on the Bates property, leaving the audience, much like Norman himself, to wonder what is happening. Around the halfway point, it's revealed that Mary was the daughter of Lila Loomis this whole time, and the two have been working together to break down Norman's sanity. They have been leaving notes for him to find, calling him, claiming to be his deceased mother, even going as far as to dress up as Mrs. Bates, giving him false visions of the past, all in the name of driving him insane so that he would be locked back up. Mary, however, growing close to Norman over the past few days, has decided to go against her mother's wishes, and tries her best to undo any damage that she might have done. It seems, however, that it's already too late. Norman only continues to speak to his mother on the phone, so mentally unstable now that he has a full conversation to a dead signal. Mary, desperate to bring Norman back to sanity, dresses up as Mrs. Bates one last time, and demands that he puts the phone down, in the process accidentally killing Norman's doctor. Right, I kinda forgot to mention, the doctor has been trying to track down Lila and Larry Loomis. The doctor has been trying to track down Lila and Larry Loomis in order to stop them from harming Norman anymore, and to prove to Norman that his mother is really dead. And he chose just the worst time to pop out of hiding. Norman, now fully unstable, sees this as just another killing he has to clean up for his mother. and, seeing Mary as his mother, attempts to hide her so that she won't be spotted by the police. The police soon enter, seeing Mary dressed as Mrs. Bates, slicing Norman all over, and react appropriately. Later at the police station, the sheriff and the rest go over the situation, assuming that all of the killings were dealt by Lila and Mary Loomis to set Norman up. And when the two had started to argue with each other, Mary killed Lila, and then attempted to do the same to Norman. Oh, yeah, I forgot. Lila was killed too, in a ridiculous death scene, but we'll talk about that later. Norman is soon released back home, allowed to get some much needed rest after the past couple of days. And then Mrs. Spool walks in, she being another one of his co-workers at the diner. She sits down and explains that Mrs. Bates was only his adoptive guardian, and that she was his real mother this whole time, and that she was the one performing the murders throughout the film, killing off anyone that treated Norman poorly.
Pardon?
Thank you for that. The movie ends on the chilling note of Norman carrying Mrs. Spool's corpse up to his mother's room, to which he soon starts to speak to it in his mother's voice.
Go downstairs and open the motel. What do you expect us to live on, Hope?
The movie beginning with Norman return to sanity, and it ending with him fully regress back to insanity. Chapter 2. Psycho 2 is really surprisingly good. There's so much I like about this film that I honestly don't know where to start. I can't believe I just said that about a sequel to Psycho. Okay, let's begin with someone that was great in the first film and is still great here. Anthony Perkins. He perfectly captures the look and feel of a man who's constantly thinking of how to respond to his situation, afraid that whatever he might say or do will be viewed as a sign of him slipping back into insanity, and thus he's constantly overcorrecting for any possible slips he might have. And later, when he does start to unravel, his actions become far more confident in nature, now no longer fearing a slip into insanity, but fully embracing the fact that he is crazy again, something that he finds comfort in, because he's rather used to the feeling. This film is also really good at making Norman Bates an incredibly sympathetic character, not only through his anxiety-filled actions, but with how others interact with him as well. And by that I mean, you'd feel sorry for the dude because of how many people just berate him.
What's the matter? You lose your nerve, huh? Or do you only attack women?
Turning a murderer loose on an innocent public?
Psycho! Hey! Hello, Psycho!
He said it! He said it!
And not only makes you feel bad for Norman, but it makes it where you don't really mind that these characters are killed off. I'm not condoning murder. I'm condoning the murder of fictional characters, which is not the same thing. And of course, the greatest way this movie makes you feel sympathy for Norman is through the actions of Lila Loomis, a woman who's going out of her way to sabotage his returned sanity. Norman is trying his best to start life anew, but it's because of Lila not letting him forget the past that he relapses. It's tragic to watch it play out. It not only makes you feel terribly sorry for Norman, but it makes you straight up despise Lila. Oh yeah, let's talk about her for a minute.
I'm Lila Loomis. I used to be Lila Crane.
Wait, Sam Loomis married you after the first film? Would that not just constantly remind you two of the worst moment in your lives? But getting back to the point, Lila Loomis is once again played by Vera Miles, reprising her role from the first film. She has made it her mission to lock Norman Bates back up, unable to see him as anything other than the psychopath that killed her sister so many years ago. She's the closest thing to a main antagonist that this film has, and I like her role here. I know some people may object to making a likable character from the first movie so unlikable in the sequel, but I have to disagree. It actually gives the character and performer something to do that isn't just a retread of what she did in the first film. It's a really smart handling of an older character. One thing I also really like is how this movie explores the dynamic between Lila and her daughter, Mary Loomis. Lila's burning hatred has turned her into a very spiteful person, and she forces her daughter to do her bidding. Similar to how Norman's mother is overbearing and strict with him, Lila has now become overbearing and strict to Mary. It's a very interesting parallel that the movie draws here, subtly showing how Lila has become a very controlling mother, and in the end is killed off by the ultimate controlling mother. Skipping forward a bit, I really like the part near the end where everyone is going over what had happened, and deduced that Lila and Mary were the crazy ones and that they had performed all of the killings to frame Norman. And when disagreements emerged, it was Mary who killed her mother. And in the end, they simply let Norman walk away because they believed that he had no part in any of it. Which, to be fair, they were actually partially correct here. Norman hadn't killed anyone in the movie. Up to this point anyway. This police station scene serves as a nice callback to the psychiatrist's monologue in the first film, which I think is pretty universally agreed to be the worst part of Psycho. The movie loses all of its momentum as it just stops to explain the plot twist to you, as if it thought you weren't smart enough to understand what was going on. It takes so much of the subtle storytelling from earlier scenes and just outwardly states their meaning, honestly robbing the audience of picking up something new on a rewatch. I really do hate this scene. It's a stand of what's otherwise a masterfully told story. But getting back to this part in Psycho 2, this is a callback to that original scene, and it just so happens to do it right. We, the audience, know what actually happened. There's someone else going around committing the murders, and Mary was only stabbing Norman because he had fully slipped back into insanity, and she was trying to protect herself. The movie creates a sense of dramatic irony. The audience know that Norman is mentally unwell, but the police don't, so when they release him, you're left wondering what's going to happen next. It also helps that the police understanding of what happened makes perfect sense from their perspective. They know for a fact that Mary and Lila were trying to drive Norman insane, and that they had a falling out due to a witness hearing an argument that the two had. And knowing for a fact that Mary did kill Norman's doctor, albeit unintentionally, led them to assume that they had killed everyone else as well. This movie takes the worst scene from the first film and actually makes it good through some really solid use of dramatic irony. I'm honestly impressed. My only minor problem with it is that Norman would be in intensive care after all of this, but that's just a nitpick. And of course you have Norman return back home, in which Mrs. Spool drops by to visit. Okay, I can't very well talk about this scene in the positives category. Time to go to Chapter 3. Why this is a good, but not great movie. Psycho 2 honestly irks me for how close it is to being great. It's really good, downright better than it has any right to be. But still, there are some things here that hold it back in quality. Before we get to my biggest complaint with the film, let's go over some more minor flaws. First off, it has to be acknowledged that the original Psycho paved the way for the slasher genre. It walked so that movies like Halloween and Friday the 13th could run. And now, Psycho 2 falls into some of the genre's traps that became very prominent in the early 80s. One major trope from this time period were characters that you didn't care about, that were just there to raise the film's body count. Now, to be fair, Psycho 2 does mostly avoid this, but then halfway through the runtime, you have these two 25-year-old teenagers break into Norman's basement to play patty cake. Literally less than 2 minutes later, the dude is stabbed to death. I literally don't even know what his name was. All I know about the guy is that he had really weird taste in makeout locations. To give slight credit where it's due, this was at least foreshadowed earlier.
I caught a couple of them screwing in the basement of your house up there last week.
But still, it's just bad storytelling to have a character pop out of nowhere just to be killed off just as quickly. The really weird thing about it is how little this affects the story overall. The police come over to investigate, Mary alibis Norman, and then they just leave. Even though they have someone that just witnessed her boyfriend being stabbed to death.
But I am not convinced that anybody was killed. There's no body.
And after that scene, this part is never brought up in the film again, nor do we ever see this character return. This is so weird. It really feels like the scene was just tagged on to give the film some slasher action. The only real point it has is to drive a wedge between Lila and Mary, but you could have done that in a less clunky way. On the topic of these two, another big problem I have here is with Mary Loomis. Her character is fine enough. At first she tries to sabotage Norman's sanity, though she slowly grows feelings for him and wishes to see him get better. I am also very thankful that this movie had the relationship only be platonic in nature. Not only is there a good 30-year age gap between the two actors here, which would have made any romance extremely hard to watch, but after what Norman has gone through, yeah, he doesn't need to worry about dating. He just needs to focus on getting some good friends right now. And their friendship would be nice and endearing if the performer playing Mary Loomis could act. Okay, that's overly mean. She's not just awful by any means, but she has the same lack of intensity in every scene. Like she's extremely bored and is only pretending to be interested in what's going on. Now, you could almost argue that that was intentional in the first half of the story, where she's secretly trying to destroy Norman's life. That performance would make sense in a scenario where she's lying through her teeth in every scene just to harm a guy. But nope, after the twist with her is revealed, she continues to act the same throughout the rest of the runtime. So as it stands, it's just a lackluster performance overall. It really does hurt the way you view her character at the end of the film. Even though she does really care for Norman now, she just feels so insecure in the way she acts. Kinda makes it where you're not all that choked up to see her killed off. Granted, I can look past her performance to a certain extent, but still, it does harm the movie. Granted, it doesn't harm the movie nearly as much as one other character. As I mentioned earlier in the plot summary, Mrs. Spool walks up to reveal that she was really Norman's mother this entire time, and that Mrs. Bates was only ever his caretaker. Okay, to be fair, this was at least hinted at throughout the movie. Someone had been calling up Norman, telling him that she was his real mother, and there has been someone killing off others, and it's finally revealed that the killer was Mrs. Spools this entire time, and she had committed the crimes because she saw that the people were harming her baby. Okay, a few things here. First off, the reason for her killing off everyone else does not check out for this dude in the basement. He was just breaking into the house with his girlfriend. He had nothing to do with Norman, so why did you kill him? To give this scene even less of a point? Also, that part happens right after Mary was walking in front of the windows dressed up as Mrs. Bates. You two were inside of the house at the same time. Why didn't you kill Mary then and there? That's not to mention how you just appear out of nowhere throughout the film, like this scene here where Mary is taking a shower, and you're watching her through the peephole. This is on the second story. How did you get up there without Norman noticing downstairs? Were you just chilling on the second floor of the house, waiting for someone to hopefully come in view of a peephole? Okay, to be fair, she's not the only one that just teleports. Look at this. Norman's doctor is in town right here, and then the next time we see him, he's right behind Mary on the second story of the Bates house. How are these people getting here so quickly? Is there just like a portal stashed away inside of Norman's bedroom? Cause otherwise, I can't figure out how they get into the house and up the stairs without anyone else noticing their arrival. But getting back to the point with Mrs. Spools, there's one of the killings here that already would have been pretty hard to believe with Norman, but it's just straight up laughable with her as the killer. Movie, do you expect me to believe that this 65-year-old grandma is strong enough to drive a knife clean through someone's mouth for it to pop out the other side? Did you write this scene before you figured out you were gonna reveal her as the killer? And getting back to the reveal itself, okay, she claims to have killed everyone off to protect her baby boy. Alright, but how did she not see that what she was doing was also negatively impacting his sanity? I'm not even talking about the murders here. She's shown to constantly call Norman claiming to be his real mother without actually telling him who she really is. She's also been darting around his house, calling him from a distance. How did you not understand that this would also chip away at his sanity? But even setting aside all of that, I hate this twist because of how out of left field it is. Yes, it's technically set up in this movie, but there was never anything in the original Psycho to suggest that Mrs. Bates wasn't Norman's mother. This is one of those retcons I can't stand, because even though I guess it can technically be true, there was nothing that even so much as hinted at it in the first place. This twist pisses me off so much that I devised a little film theory so that I don't have to take it at face value. I hypothesized that Mrs. Spool was simply a crazy old lady that had no relation to Norman whatsoever, but, obviously being of the controlling type, decided she wanted to try to take over his life much like Mrs. Bates did back when she was alive. Thus, Mrs. Spool forcibly entered into Norman's life via any means necessary, drastically underestimating the effect her actions would have on his psyche. I know there's nothing in this film to suggest that, but there is nothing in the first film to suggest the twist here, so let me have my fun. I know I've been harping on this for a good minute now, but I can't emphasize enough how this twist hampers my enjoyment of the film overall. To be fair though, it's made almost bearable by what happens immediately afterwards. Norman kills Mrs. Spool and the movie ends on the note of him speaking to her in his mother's voice.
Put me in my chair.
Yes, Mother.
Remember, Norman, only your mother truly loves you.
That's a great note for this film to end on, but it just had to follow after this nonsense. Bottom line, this is just a blotch in what is otherwise a really competently told story. This, above all my other issues with this film, is what holds it back from me calling it truly great. Chapter 4. The Snake Eats Itself. Okay, so this has nothing to do with my opinion of Psycho 2, but there were a few funny things I noticed about this movie that I couldn't help but at least bring up. If you've seen my Friday the 13th video, you know how I mentioned that that film borrowed a few themes and ideas from Psycho, and how it seems that Psycho 2 decided to take a few themes from Friday the 13th in return. Now, to be fair, this film was going to draw some parallels to the Friday the 13th series regardless, because, again, the first entry really did take a lot from Psycho, so some similarities were gonna be unavoidable. Though Psycho 2 goes beyond just a few similarities. Okay, to really illustrate my point, let me lay it out for ya. The plot of the movie focuses on several killings taking place, all of them being shot in a way where the murderer is never shown on camera, leading the characters and audience to wonder who is committing the killings, only for it to be revealed at the end that it was a seemingly nice old lady who had been performing the murders this entire time, under the mistaken idea that she was defending her son from the people she had killed, only for her to then be swiftly killed off as well. Oh, and for our bonus round, you also have a scene of a girl dressing up as the mother to trick the son. Again, some comparisons were gonna be unavoidable either way, but I can't help but feel that Psycho 2 decided to play with some of the ideas that Friday the 13th introduced, making it come full circle. And again, this doesn't harm my enjoyment of Psycho 2, because mostly I find it to be a much better movie than Friday the 13th. Okay, now that we're near the end, let's wrap things up with Chapter 5. Seriously, watch the movie. Psycho 2 is a surprisingly good sequel. I would honestly argue that it's one of the best legacy sequels out there. And yeah, there were some things that knocked it down a peg or two in my book, but at the end of the day, I did still really enjoy it. I know some people will be apprehensive just at the idea of a sequel to Psycho, and I would not blame you if you avoid this film just because of how bad legacy sequels generally are. Though Psycho 2 rose to the challenge and managed to be really good. It was made by a group of filmmakers that actually cared about trying to make a quality sequel to Psycho, and they succeeded. There's only so many ways that I can say it. Give this movie a watch if you're a fan of the first. You'll be pleasantly surprised. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and until next time, goodbye y'all.